They say that silence is the first door to wisdom. In the ancient traditions of the East, there is a teaching that few truly understand. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something far deeper. It is like a secret garden that few dare to explore, but those who do discover treasures beyond imagination. In a temple nestled in the misty mountains of the East, where time seemed to flow differently, lived a young monk whose mind was always in turmoil. His thoughts were like leaves in the wind, restless and scattered, and his voice constantly echoed through the sacred halls. He believed that through words he would find all the answers he sought. His relentless pursuit of knowledge drove him to question everything and everyone, filling every moment of silence with inquiries and observations. One autumn morning, as golden leaves danced in the air like tiny flames, the temple's headmaster invited him for a walk to the monastery's oldest garden. It was a place rarely visited, hidden behind moss-covered stone walls. The young monk, eager as always, began asking questions the moment they passed through the weathered wooden gate. But with a simple gesture, the master requested silence. At the center of the garden, an elderly man worked among the plants. His wrinkled hands moved with the precision of someone who knew every inch of that sacred soil. The young monk had never seen him before, yet something about the man emanated a profound peace. The gardener did not use common tools. His hands were his only instruments, touching the earth with the tenderness of one caressing something precious. For hours, the master and the young monk watched the gardener work in silence. There was no haste in his movements, no anxiety in his actions. Each gesture was like an ancient dance, a sacred ritual that transformed the simple act of tending the garden into a deep meditation. As the sun journeyed across the sky, something extraordinary began to happen. First, a single butterfly, its wings painted with the very light of the sun, landed on the gardener's shoulder. He did not move, did not try to touch it. He simply continued his work with the same serenity. Soon, another butterfly joined the first, then another and another, until the gardener was surrounded by a delicate dance of colorful wings. The young monk was in awe. His first impulse was to run to the gardener and ask for his secret, how he was able to attract such elusive creatures. But something stopped him. For the first time in his life, he felt that any word would shatter something precious that was unfolding before him. The hours passed like seconds. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. One by one, the butterflies departed in their silent dance. At last, the gardener stood up, bowed gently to the garden, and walked toward the exit. As he passed the young monk and his master, he simply smiled, a smile that held all the wisdom of the universe. That night, lying in his bed, the young monk understood something that would change his life forever. True knowledge did not come from words or questions, but from the ability to be fully present in silence. As the gardener had shown, when we truly quiet ourselves, nature itself draws near, revealing its deepest secrets. In his heart, a transformation began. The restlessness that had always consumed him started to dissolve like mist beneath the morning sun. His once turbulent thoughts began to settle like the waters of a lake after a storm. And in his newfound silence, he could finally hear the whisper of wisdom that had always been there, patiently waiting to be discovered. Dawn arrived with a different kind of softness for the young monk. His hands still carried the scent of the earth from the garden the day before, and his eyes held the dance of the butterflies as a precious treasure. But the universe had more lessons to teach, and they would come in an unexpected way. The temple bell rang, announcing the time for the morning meal. The young monk walked down the ancient wooden corridor toward the communal dining hall, his bare feet feeling every knot in the wood, polished by decades of silent footsteps. The aroma of steamed rice and vegetable soup filled the air, mingling with the incense that always burned in the temple's corners. The dining hall was a spacious chamber with high windows that welcomed the golden morning light. Dark wooden pillars supported the ceiling, and long, low tables stretched in orderly rows. The monks kneeled in their designated places, each with their own bowl, simple ceramic pieces that carried silent stories of countless meals. Then it happened. An elderly monk, known for his decades of dedicated practice, rose to serve tea. His movements were usually precise and graceful, but that morning, something was different. Perhaps it was a moment of distraction, a slight imbalance, or simply fate choosing its moment to teach. The bowl slipped from his hands as if it had a will of its own. For an instant it seemed to float in the air, reflecting the morning light on its glazed surface. Time slowed as all eyes followed its descent. The sound of ceramic shattering against the wooden floor echoed through the hall like thunder on a clear day. The young monk instinctively braced for the chaos that would surely follow. In his mind, he had already imagined hurried apologies, disapproving glances, a flurry of voices offering help or criticism. But none of that happened. The elderly monk remained perfectly still for a moment, as if in deep meditation. His face showed no distress, no shame, no irritation. With the same grace as his usual movements, he slowly kneeled beside the scattered shards. There was a serenity in his expression that seemed to brighten the entire room. One by one, he began gathering the fragments of the bowl. Each movement was deliberate, mindful, as if he were handling the petals of a rare flower. The silence in the hall was so profound that the soft clinking of the broken pieces being placed into his sleeve could be heard. Other monks silently stepped forward to help, moving like shadows in a coordinated dance. No one spoke. There was no need. Every gesture, every movement was a communication clearer than any words could be. The young monk watched in fascination. The night before, he had learned about silence through harmony with nature. Now, he was witnessing a different kind of silence, the kind that accepts the inevitable with grace and dignity. When the last shard had been gathered and the floor cleaned, the elderly monk bowed deeply to everyone present. In his eyes, there was a peace even deeper than before. It was as if the broken bowl had revealed something precious hidden beneath the surface of daily routine. The rest of the meal proceeded in a silence that carried a new meaning. The young monk barely touched his food, lost in contemplation. He realized that silence was not merely an absence of noise or a pause between words. It was a way of accepting reality exactly as it was, without resistance, without judgment. That morning, the young monk understood that some of the deepest lessons did not come from great events or lengthy teachings, but from small moments of imperfection accepted with grace and silence. The broken bowl had become a mirror, reflecting a truth that words could never fully express. After the silent meal, the young monk left the dining hall with a heart full of contemplation. The sun was already high in the sky, and the midday heat was beginning to settle in. The temple corridors, usually quiet at this hour, felt different today. An unusual sound echoed through the ancient wooden halls, raised voices coming from the central courtyard. Following the sound, he arrived at one of the most sacred places in the temple, the courtyard of the ancient cherry trees. It was a circular space, paved with grey stones, worn smooth by time, surrounded by trees that had witnessed generations of teachings. In the center, an old stone fountain murmured its eternal song, though today its music was muffled by heated voices. Two scholarly monks, known for their dedication to ancient texts, were engaged in a passionate debate. Their saffron robes fluttered with the intensity of their gestures, and their voices rose higher and higher into the afternoon air. Between them, on a low wooden table, lay an ancient scroll, its edges yellowed with age. "The nature of the mind is like a mirror that reflects all things," argued one, his face flushed with conviction. "The text is clear about this." No, you are completely mistaken," countered the other, tapping the page lightly with his index finger. The mind is like the sky itself, formless and boundless. The young monk watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and unease. Just 2 days ago, he himself would have eagerly joined the discussion, eager to share his own interpretations and theories. But his recent experiences with silence had begun to shift something deep within him. It was then that a silent presence emerged from the shadows of the corridor. It was the eldest monk in the temple, a man so old that some said he had seen the cherry trees being planted. His face was a map of deep wrinkles, each telling stories of decades of practice and contemplation. The elder approached the debate with slow, deliberate steps. His robe, faded by countless summers, brushed softly against the stones of the courtyard. The two debating monks, so absorbed in their discussion, did not immediately notice his presence. Without a word, the elder monk sat on a nearby stone bench, closed his eyes, and began to breathe deeply. His presence was like a mountain, still, unwavering, deeply rooted in the earth. Slowly, like water finding its natural level, the tone of the voices began to soften. The elder's silence was more eloquent than any argument. It was a silence that seemed to emanate wisdom, like the natural fragrance of a flower. The two debating monks began to feel the weight of this silence, and their words faded from their lips. The young monk watched in awe as the silence transformed the atmosphere of the courtyard. The cherry leaves swayed gently in the breeze, and the sound of the fountain became audible again, its steady murmur reminding them that some truths exist beyond words. At last, the elder monk opened his eyes. His gaze was compassionate, like a deep lake reflecting the sky. Slowly, he rose to his feet and, before departing, offered a gentle bow to the three of them, the two scholars and the young monk who had been observing. On his face was a smile that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the texts they had been debating. The two scholarly monks exchanged glances, and for the first time that afternoon, they truly saw each other. They bowed to one another, their faces now serene, touched by the silent understanding that had settled over the courtyard. The young monk remained there long after everyone had left. The sound of the fountain, the whisper of the leaves, the occasional song of a bird. It all seemed to be part of a teaching deeper than any text could contain. He understood that some truths can only be found in the space between words, in the silence that holds all the answers. The sun had begun its descent toward the west when the young monk left the cherry blossom courtyard. The late afternoon air carried the sweetness of the day's end, and shadows stretched long across the temple corridors. His steps led him to the reception hall, where visitors were traditionally welcomed. It was a simple yet inviting space, with well-maintained tatami mats covering the floor and a single painting of mountains hanging on the wall. The gentle scent of incense lingered in the air, blending with the aroma of green tea that was always being prepared for guests. That was when he heard it. At first, just muffled sobs, then a murmuring of words broken by heavy breaths. A man had arrived at the temple. His clothes, though of fine quality, were wrinkled, as if he had traveled for days. His face bore not only the weight of physical exhaustion, but also the mark of a deep sorrow, consuming him from within. "They destroyed everything," the man burst out, his words spilling forth in waves of anguish. "My reputation, my work, my family, all because of lies. Lies they spread about me, years of dedication, ruined by envy and malice." The monk who received him was known for his mastery in preparing tea. His movements were precise and graceful as he carried out his task, as if performing a sacred ceremony. He did not say a word while the visitor continued his outpouring. "You don't understand," the man went on, his voice trembling with emotion. "These were people I considered friends, people I helped, people I trusted. How could they do this to me? How can I go on living, knowing that everything I built has been destroyed by lies?" The tea monk continued his preparation in silence. He heated the water to the exact point where tiny bubbles began to form. what tea masters called fish eyes. He carefully selected the leaves, measuring the precise amount. Every movement was executed with complete presence and attention. The visitor, lost in his despair, barely noticed the ritual unfolding before him. His words kept pouring out, filled with bitterness and resentment. He spoke of betrayal, of injustice, of sleepless nights and days of torment. His pain was tangible, filling the room like a heavy cloud. From the entrance, the young monk observed something remarkable happening. The silence of the tea monk was not empty or indifferent. It was an active silence, a welcoming one, like an empty vessel ready to receive fresh water. Each quiet movement was a response, each gesture a form of deep listening. Little by little, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. The visitor's words, once rushed and frantic, started to slow. His breath, once ragged and heavy, found a more natural rhythm. The tea monk continued his quiet ritual, now pouring the hot water over the leaves with the precision of an artist painting a masterpiece. The aroma of tea filled the room, carrying with it a new kind of silence. It was as if the very air was being purified, not only of past scents, but also of the emotional weight that had saturated it moments before. When the monk finally offered the bowl of tea to the visitor, his silence had become something almost tangible. The man took the bowl in both hands, feeling its warmth. For the first time since his arrival, he fell silent. His tears still flowed, but now they were different. Not of rage or despair, but of a sorrow that had begun to find its path toward healing. The young monk watched as the visitor gradually settled into his own silence. The unspoken words now held more power than all those that had been spoken. In the space of that shared silence, something was being healed. When the visitor finally departed hours later, his face had changed. The storm in his eyes had quieted, not because his troubles had disappeared, but because he had found a place of peace within his own turmoil. The tea monk simply bowed in farewell, never having spoken a single word. Twilight had begun to paint the sky in hues of purple and gold when the temple bell rang, announcing the final meditation of the day. The young monk, still absorbed in the experiences he had witnessed in the tea room, made his way to the main meditation hall. His heart felt different, lighter, more aware, as if each lesson in silence he had received over the past days had laid a layer of wisdom upon his being. The meditation hall was the heart of the temple, a vast circular space supported by ancient wooden beams that seemed to reach for the sky. Paper lanterns hung from the high ceiling, their soft glow casting dancing shadows on the rice paper walls. The scent of sandalwood lingered in the air like an unseen yet constant presence. The monks began entering silently, one after another, like raindrops falling into a serene lake. Among them, the young monk recognized each figure who had crossed his path in recent days. The silent gardener who danced with butterflies, the elderly monk with the broken bowl, the two scholars from the courtyard, now at peace with one another, and the tea monk, his face as serene as ever. Each one took their place on the meditation mats arranged in concentric circles. The young monk found his spot near one of the open windows where he could feel the night breeze carrying the fragrance of the garden and the last birdsong of the day. As the sun continued its descent beyond the mountains, a subtle transformation began to unfold. The silence, which had once seemed like a mere absence of sound, started to take on a different quality. It was as if each breath of the meditating monks was weaving an invisible tapestry of peace. The sounds of nature, which the young monk had never truly listened to before, began to reveal themselves in a perfect symphony. The gentle rustling of leaves in the temple's ancient trees, the distant call of an owl announcing the night, the murmur of the stream flowing nearby, each sound was like a note in a sacred melody that had always been there, waiting to be heard. The lanterns glowed more brightly against the darkening sky, and the shadows on the walls seemed to tell silent stories. The young monk closed his eyes, not to escape the outer world, but to immerse himself more deeply within it. In his silence, he began to understand how all the teachings of the past days were connected. The gardener's quiet presence that attracted butterflies was no different from the silence of the monk with the broken bowl. The wise silence of the elder in the courtyard was the same healing silence of the tea master. All were expressions of the same fundamental truth. Hours passed like moments. Night had fully settled, and the stars shone through the open windows like diamonds on black velvet. The air was still, as if even time itself had paused to contemplate the scene. It was then that the young monk experienced something beyond the reach of words. It was as if all the kinds of silence he had encountered in the past days had converged into a single moment of crystal-clear understanding. In that instant, he realized that silence was not something to be sought or achieved, but something to be recognized as the very nature of existence itself. Silent tears began to roll down his cheeks, not from sadness or joy, but from a deep understanding that transcended ordinary emotions. Each drop was like a pearl of wisdom dissolving into his being. When the bell rang once more, marking the end of the meditation, the young monk remained still. The other monks slowly began to rise, but he sat unmoving, absorbed in the peace he had discovered. Silence was now his teacher, his companion, his very nature. The full moon had risen in the sky, spilling its silver light through the hall's windows. In his heart, the young monk knew he had found something precious, not knowledge that could be expressed in words, but a truth that could only be lived in the sacred silence of each moment. At dawn, the young monk awoke before the sun had risen. The experience of the previous night still echoed within him, like ripples on a lake after the touch of a single drop. His heart was light, yet his mind was restless with one final question. How could he maintain this peace amidst the turbulence of the world? Following his steps, he found himself once again in the garden where his journey had begun. Morning dew covered each leaf like tiny diamonds, and a gentle mist wrapped around the trees in an ethereal embrace. But something was different. The garden was being undone. The same elderly gardener who had danced with the butterflies was now removing plants, completely transforming the space he had so carefully cultivated. His hands, which only days before had caressed each leaf with infinite love, were now uprooting the very same plants with equal serenity. A group of young monks watched the scene, visibly unsettled. One of them, unable to contain his distress, approached the headmaster, who observed the gardener's work in silence. "Master," he whispered, "why allow such a perfect garden to be destroyed? Years of cultivation, of care. How can the gardener be so serene while dismantling his own creation?" The master smiled, and within that smile lay all the wisdom of the universe. "Look more closely," he replied. "The gardener is not destroying, he is releasing. Each plant will be replanted in the valley below, where a village was devastated by a flood. The garden will continue its journey, bringing beauty to those who need it most." The young monk watched in awe. The gardener worked with the same care and presence he had shown days before. There was no sorrow in his movements, no attachment to what he was leaving behind. His silence was the same, full, complete, perfect. At that moment, all the lessons came together in a single moment of crystalline understanding. The silence of the garden had taught him harmony with nature. The broken bowl had revealed the serene acceptance of the inevitable. The courtyard debate had shown the power of silence in transcending conflict. The anguished visitor had demonstrated how silence could heal deep wounds. The evening meditation had unveiled the unity underlying all silences. And now, the garden's transformation was teaching him the final and deepest lesson. True silence is free from attachment. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, bathing the garden in golden light, the young monk understood the final message. Silence is not a practice to be mastered, but a truth to be lived. It is the ability to be fully present in every moment, whether in creation or dissolution, in joy or sorrow, in meeting or farewell. True silence is not the absence of sound, but the total presence within the eternal dance of life. It is the wisdom of knowing when to speak and when to remain quiet, when to act and when to observe, when to hold on and when to let go. It is the deep understanding that, like butterflies visiting the garden without ever trying to possess it, life flows most beautifully when we allow it to move in freedom. And so, on that morning of transformation, the young monk finally understood. Silence is the sacred space where all truths meet, where all apparent contradictions dissolve, and where the deepest wisdom blooms naturally, like a lotus rising from the murky waters to blossom beneath the sun of awareness. In a world that grows ever noisier, where words often obscure more than they reveal, silence emerges as a universal teacher. It shows us that true wisdom is not in accumulating knowledge, but in creating space for truth to reveal itself naturally. When we learn to dwell in silence with grace and presence, we discover that it contains all the answers we seek, not as information to be acquired, but as truths to be lived.